Hello and welcome to a new video. In this video I briefly want to talk about a new lens that's come to light, which is the Canon RF 600mm F11 IS STM lens. I want to talk about this lens in more detail because I think it's an important lens to talk about. Now, I recently watched a review of a famous YouTuber on this lens, and I want to give you my take on this as someone that does wildlife photography and sports photography from time to time, and talk about where I think this lens is positioned in the marketplace. So it's going to compete directly with the Sigma 150 to 600 lenses in terms of price. I think the contemporary is around £750 as this lens is. But I really need to talk about the exposure triangle in this video. Now, you've got ISO, aperture and shutter speed. Now, it's all a balancing act to get the correct aperture and shutter speed and the correct ISO. Try and get a shutter speed that's significantly high enough in order to freeze action. And that's the ultimate goal of most wildlife and sports photographers, is to freeze action and get a good result in the photography world. So I'm struggling to see how an F11 lens is useful at all, because it's a very dark aperture, a very small hole letting out a very small amount of light in. F11 could be susceptible to diffraction, but I'm really struggling to see how this lens will produce any good results in low light situations. It's just too dark. Now, in good light during sunny days, let's say you live in California, you aren't going to have a problem with this lens. However, if you live in Scandinavia, Europe, UK, any country where it has bad weather, this lens isn't going to provide you with the results you want unless your subject matter is absolutely still. So for static subjects, it'd be fine. But for moving objects, sports photography, wildlife photography, forget about this lens. It's no good to you. Don't get me wrong, from the results I've seen, it's sharp. It's a good lens, good quality, don't get me wrong, but that aperture is a big sticking point. Price-wise, it's comparable to the Sigma 150 to 600 and the Tamron G1. The G2 version is around the £1,000 mark. Personally, if I was advising someone, I'd go for the contemporary 150 to 600 with its 6.3 aperture, which is significantly lighter than the F11. If you can afford it, get a better lens. You can always adapt EF lenses to the mirrorless R5 and R6 cameras. It's true, the new mirrorless cameras will have significantly better sensors. That means that ISO will be able to cope and be higher than, say, the SLR counterparts. But it just seemed to me that Canon are starting to move away from the EF lenses and the EFL lenses and moving towards the new RF format. To me, this is just a money-grabbing exercise, really. Just like the consoles, such as your PS3s, and then you have PS4s, and now I think the PS5s are coming out soon. And then they stop supporting the older ones because the new ones are out, and they want to make money, obviously, off the newer machines. And the same is true with the mounts on cameras, But it will produce sharp imagery. F11 though is a really dark aperture, and you will struggle to get good results with that aperture without raising your ISO. The problem is when you raise your ISO, now if you're not familiar with photography terms, when I say ISO, it's the sensitivity of your sensor in your camera, and the more you raise it up, right, the quality of your imagery suffers because of noise. And if you're old school, we used to call that grain. We used to use film back in the day. So that's the problem with the exposure triangle. When you've got controlling shutter speed, aperture and ISO, and you're trying to get a high enough shutter speed to capture that imagery to stop motion, you're going to struggle with this lens to get that. I'd highly recommend other alternatives, such as the Sigma zooms. It might not be quite as sharp as these lenses, these new RF primes, but primes are always going to be zooms no matter what, no matter how good they are. I've got the 100 to 400 Mark II EF lens L, it's extremely sharp. but I know that it's not as good as a prime, you know, even a cheap prime. You've got to remember that when it comes to choosing your lenses, and you need to find the lens that's right for you. Personally, if I was advising someone about getting a lens, it depends what you want to use it for, really. If you've not got a lot of money, I could understand why you might think this is an interesting lens to get. However, I would probably steer you towards the Sigma lenses, to be honest with you. Price point is pretty much the same. The Sigma 150 to 600 contemporary is the same price as this RF lens, and I understand you'd probably have to get an adapter, but there is a Sigma adapter you can get, which is pretty good. So I just wanted to talk about this lens a little bit in this video and give you my advice. To be honest with you, if I was focusing on sports in the UK, for example, I would not want to buy this lens because most of the year it's overcast, it's dark, and you won't get very good results with this. Doing wildlife photography during sunset, sunrise, where lights are going to be minimal, you're going to struggle again with this lens. I don't want to slate this lens off too much because it does have 4 stops of image stabilization. That's fantastic, that's great. The problem is image stabilization doesn't make up for subjects that are moving. When it comes to subjects that are moving, cars moving, F1 cars driving at 90 miles an hour, you know, you've got birds flying at say 30, 40 miles an hour. This lens can't compensate for that. To stop that action, to get great imagery, you need fast shutter speeds. You need 600 of a second minimum to stop action with this sort of lens. On a bright sunny day, it will be great, and it probably will perform and probably give you enough shutter speed stopping motion. But on overcast days, forget about it. You're gonna need a 2.8 or an f4 lens minimum when it's a dark day. And obviously when you start raising your ISO, the sensitivity of your sensor on your camera, you're going to start introducing noise. Now I know a lot of cameras can go up to 20,000 ISO, but the problem is when you start going beyond say 2, 3, 4,000 ISO, then you start introducing massive amounts of noise and artifacts into your images to a point where it's just not usable. You know, it's a bit like the top speed of a sports car, you know. While you can travel at 200 miles an hour, the law says 70. So what's the point of having an extra 130 miles an hour top speed? Pretty pointless. So I just wanted to talk about this lens and give you my take on it. You know, suggestions of alternatives is the 100 to 400 Mark II EF. You can always get an adapter. That's 5.6 aperture. The Sigma and Tamron's 150 to 600 with an aperture of 6.3. Also the Canon Prime EF lens 300 f4. There is a 400mm 5.6, which is relatively cheap as well. The 300 f4 is a really good lens. You can put an extender on that will turn that to about I think it's 460mm, something like that. It's at 5.6. But that has 2 stops of image stabilization. I always found that lens really good, you know. So that's my take on this RF lens. You know, it's my point of view. Take it or leave it. Yeah, I just think F11 is just too dark for a good Canon lens. I really don't know what Canon's thinking of. When you compare that Sigma and Tamron have brought out zooms that got more glassing, 150 to 600, and they're at 6.3. And then Canon brings out a prime lens, which means if it's got less glass, it uses less light. So in theory, you could probably have a 600mm prime that would be f4 and still be relatively cheap. You know, it's your choice whether you want to go for something like this. I just hope my thoughts on this. I've sort of given you food for thought on whether you think this is a good lens, but I really have to advise you that F11 is very dark. And again, I hope these videos were helpful and I hope you learned something. Thank you. Bye bye.